Trump's new press secretary just took down Ilhan Omar and the entire Democratic establishment, exposing their blatant hypocrisy on live TV. You won't believe how she used the media's own words against them. The press room was packed, cameras flashing, reporters bracing themselves with laptops open, the air thick with anticipation and quiet hostility. Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the podium, her movements measured, controlled. She adjusted the microphone, her sharp gaze scanning the room. She already knew how this was going to play out. This wasn't just a briefing, it was a battleground where the media held their pre-written narratives like loaded weapons. She smiled, but there was steel behind it. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I know you've all been eager for this briefing, so let's get right to it." A calculated pause. "Before we begin, let's establish something. If the media is going to set the rules of outrage, they should at least be consistent." A shift in the room. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing the storm ahead. Karoline placed her hands on the podium, locking eyes with the front row. "If a Republican stood here today and said, 'We need to fight in the streets,' you'd be foaming at the mouth, demanding resignations, congressional investigations, maybe even arrests. But when Ilhan Omar says it, suddenly it's just a passionate plea for justice." The tension was instant, murmurs rippling through the crowd. They had come prepared to put her on the defensive, but Karoline had just flipped the script. A hand shot up, Peter from CNN, predictably. He cleared his throat, his voice laced with skepticism. "Karoline, are you suggesting that Ilhan Omar's comments were meant to incite violence?" Karoline tilted her head as if Peter had just asked if water was wet. "I'm not suggesting anything, Peter. I'm quoting her. Or do you deny she said it?" He hesitated, cameras zooming in, catching the flicker of uncertainty in his face. She leaned forward slightly. "Let's be clear, when Democrats call for fighting in the streets, it's dismissed as rhetoric. But when a Republican so much as breathes the wrong way, it's a threat to democracy. So tell me, Peter, what's the rule here? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the rules only apply to one side." Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. No response. Another reporter, a woman from NBC, jumped in, shifting the angle. "Surely you're not suggesting the president is above criticism?" Ilhan Omar was simply expressing concerns about this administration's policies. Karoline turned to her, unimpressed. So was every conservative who got labeled a domestic extremist for daring to question the Biden administration. Funny how that works. Silence. Reporters shuffled their notes, searching for an opening, but Karoline wasn't done. She glanced at the cameras. This wasn't just for the press. It was for every American watching. "Let's play a game," she said, voice calm. "Imagine if President Trump stood here today and said, 'We need to take this fight to the streets.' What would happen?" No answer. She let the silence stretch just long enough before answering it herself. Front page hysteria. Emergency broadcasts. Calls for impeachment. The media would be in full meltdown mode. But Ilhan Omar says it? Nothing. Just another Tuesday. More silence. The energy shifted. The press had come to corner her, but now they were the ones on the defensive. Then James from NBC, a veteran journalist, broke the tension. "Are you saying that outrage over political rhetoric is selective?" Karoline raised an eyebrow. "I don't need to say it, James. You all prove it, every single day." Murmurs spread. Reporters whispered, fingers tapping against keyboards. Then Peter tried again, sharper this time. "But Karoline, don't you think context matters?" Ilhan Omar was referring to. Karoline's lips curled slightly. "Oh, I love that word with context. Because when President Trump said, 'Peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard,' you all conveniently ignored the context. In fact, you twisted it to try and throw him in jail." A ripple went through the press corps, someone coughed, another reporter muttered under their breath, and Peter clenched his jaw. But before he could fire back, Karoline held up a hand. "You want to talk about context, Peter? Let's talk about it. Ilhan Omar didn't say peacefully and patriotically. She said, we have to fight in the streets. So I'll ask again, why is it different? Silence. No one wanted to answer that question. Then, as if on cue, a phone buzzed from the front row. A reporter glanced at the screen, eyes widening before looking up. Karoline noticed. What is it? She asked casually. The reporter hesitated. Ilhan Omar just tweeted about you. Karoline let out a quiet chuckle. Of course she did. She turned back to the room, completely unbothered. Let me guess, she's calling me dangerous? Maybe even a racist? Classic. Reaching for the iPad on the podium, she pulled up the live tweet. Then, in a clear, deliberate voice, she read it aloud. Karoline Leavitt is spreading dangerous rhetoric to distract from Trump's reckless agenda. She looked back at the room, scanning the reporters. That's cute. But here's the thing, her words are on video, plain as day. And she doesn't get to decide what's dangerous and what's not. The press corps sat in silence. They knew she had a point, they just didn't know how to admit it. Karoline let the weight of her words settle over the room. This wasn't over. Not even close. Straightening, she let her sharp gaze sweep the room. Next question. The tension was suffocating. The press had walked in expecting to control the narrative, yet here they were, cornered. Karoline tapped her fingers lightly against the podium, waiting. She knew someone would try to shift the conversation, to regain control. James from the Washington Post took the bait. Karoline, he started, measured but firm, you're quoting Ilhan Omar's words, but are you really suggesting she meant them as a call for violence? Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if amused. James, am I supposed to believe she meant it as a poetry reading? A few low chuckles rippled through the room. James cleared his throat, pressing forward. But rhetoric is open to interpretation. You're treating her words as dangerous, but what about Trump's past statements? Don't you think some of them could also be seen as incendiary? Karoline gave him a slow nod, as if he had just walked into her trap. Oh, I see what you're doing, she said. So now intent matters? That's interesting. She let that hang in the air before continuing. Because when Trump said, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, the media spent years claiming it was a call to violence. James shifted slightly, he didn't like where this was going. But when Ilhan Omar literally says, we have to fight in the streets, suddenly, we need context. Silence. Karoline nodded, her tone steady but sharp. This isn't about heated rhetoric, James. This is about who is allowed to use it. Reporters exchanged glances, some typing frantically, others waiting for a counterattack. Peter from CNN took the shot. Karoline, you say there's a double standard, but let's be honest, Trump's rhetoric has led to real-world violence. Can you honestly compare that to Ilhan Omar's words? Karoline let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Oh, Peter, she sighed. You people never disappoint. She reached for her iPad, swiping quickly before turning the screen toward the cameras. This is Bernard Felix, she said. Just arrested for attacking a Republican volunteer, shouted that they deserve to die. She swiped again. This man? Firebombed a GOP office. Told police he was following orders. Another swipe. And this, she paused, letting the silence build, is the man who shot a Republican congressman on a baseball field. No one spoke. Karoline set the iPad down, folding her arms. So tell me, Peter, she said, her voice smooth but cutting, do these count as real-world consequences? Or does political violence only matter when it fits your narrative? A visible shift in the room. Reporters looked uncomfortable, some avoided eye contact. Then, from the back, a younger MSNBC journalist forced a question out. But Karoline, he said cautiously, you're cherry-picking cases to make a broader claim. Isn't it dangerous to suggest that one side is responsible for all political violence? Karoline turned to him, eyes narrowing slightly. Ah, so now we care about nuance? The reporter stiffened. Karoline continued, her voice firm. I find it funny how Trump supporters get blamed for everything, from election protests to a hoax noose in NASCAR, but when a Democrat literally says, we need to fight in the streets, suddenly we need to look at the bigger picture. She let the question linger in the air. Nobody answered. She exhaled slightly, checking her watch. We're barely 20 minutes in, and you've already proved my point. Karoline tapped the podium once, looking back up. The truth is, this was never about fighting rhetoric, it was always about controlling who was allowed to speak. Still no response. She straightened, ready for the next battle. Next question. The tension in the press room was thick. Reporters shuffled their notes, recalibrating. The narrative wasn't going how they had planned. Karoline Leavitt had just dismantled their selective outrage over political rhetoric, but they weren't done, they had another card to play. Elon Musk. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, pen tapping against his notepad. Karoline, he started, carefully measured, let's talk about Elon Musk's new role. The president's decision to appoint him as head of the Department of Government Efficiency, isn't that just a way to reward a billionaire ally? A few reporters nodded, sensing a possible weak point. Karoline almost laughed. Here we go. Oh, so now you all care about billionaires influencing government? She folded her arms. That's funny, because I don't remember any of you complaining when Mark Zuckerberg spent $400 million to influence elections. Silence. She pressed on. Or when Jeff Bezos received billions in government contracts while owning a newspaper that conveniently never criticizes the left. Peter from CNN interjected quickly, trying to regain control. But Karoline, Musk isn't just any billionaire, he's been openly aligned with Trump's policies. Isn't this appointment just a case of political favoritism? Karoline didn't even blink. You mean the same way Hunter Biden received cushy foreign business deals while his father was vice president? Or the way Nancy Pelosi's husband magically made all the right stock trades before major legislative decisions? The room stiffened. Funny how political favoritism only seems to be an issue when it involves someone the media doesn't like. James adjusted his tie, pushing forward. But Karoline, let's talk about oversight. Elon Musk now has access to government systems, specifically in the Treasury and DOJ. Shouldn't the American people be concerned about a private businessman having influence over public finances? Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice firm. Let's get our facts straight, James. The DOJ engineers Musk is working with only have read-only access to Treasury systems. They cannot write new code. A few reporters exchanged glances, they knew she was right. She continued. And let's be honest, what really bothers you isn't Musk having oversight, it's that he's actually going to expose how much taxpayer money has been wasted. The room fell silent for a second. Then, from the back, a young journalist from NBC raised her voice. But Karoline, Musk's companies, including SpaceX and Tesla, have received billions in government subsidies. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest? Karoline tilted her head slightly, unimpressed. That's interesting, because the Biden administration literally appointed former Google and Facebook executives to government roles overseeing tech regulations. A few cameras zoomed in, catching the growing unease in the room. But somehow, that's not a conflict of interest. More silence. Karoline scanned the room, sensing that the energy had shifted. They weren't getting the attack angle they wanted. She decided to drive it home. This administration was elected to drain the swamp, to cut waste, and to make government run like a business, not like some slush fund for career politicians. She let the words settle. Now, I get it, the media doesn't like that, because if the government actually became efficient, what would the Democratic Party campaign on? A few suppressed chuckles. A few glares. Karoline checked the time. All right, she said, knowing they weren't done yet. Next question. The press had failed to corner Karoline on Elon Musk, but they had another attack ready. Peter from CNN jumped in. Karoline, NBC reports that some illegal immigrants arrested under Trump's policies aren't being deported. Instead, they're being released with ankle monitors or phone check-ins. Isn't that a failure? Karoline barely held back a smirk. She had seen this coming. I'm glad you asked, Peter, she said. Let's talk numbers. She glanced at the cameras. As of this morning, over 8,000 illegal immigrants have been arrested under President Trump's policies, she stated. And out of those, only 461 have been released. That's less than 6%. Silence. But the media spins it as if mass releases are happening. James from the Washington Post pushed back. But Karoline, doesn't this prove Trump's policies aren't working? Why is anyone being released at all? Karoline didn't blink. Some were released due to medical conditions, others because detention space is limited. She tilted her head. And who's blocking funding for more detention centers? She let the question hang. The reporters knew exactly who was responsible. A young MSNBC journalist jumped in. But Karoline, many of these individuals haven't committed crimes. Are you treating all undocumented immigrants as criminals? Karoline laughed lightly. Oh, so now you care about the difference? She scanned the room. I remember when you all called Trump racist for deporting gang members. A few reporters shifted uncomfortably. But let's be clear, she continued. Entering this country illegally is already breaking the law. Peter from CNN tried again. Are you saying the administration has no responsibility for these releases? Karoline locked eyes with him. We are deporting as many as possible. But when Congress blocks resources, they can't turn around and blame us. Silence. Karoline checked the time. Well, she said, her tone light but firm. Next question. The media had failed to pin Karoline on immigration, but they weren't done yet. James from the Washington Post leaned in, flipping through his notes. Karoline, the president has made it clear that Palestinians have no choice but to leave Gaza, but they say this is their home. How does the administration justify this? Karoline remained composed, her eyes scanning the room. The president's goal is simple, she said. Rebuild Gaza, ensure peace, and prevent another war. A slight pause. But let's be honest, she continued, the media keeps asking what Trump is doing but never asks why Gaza is in ruins in the first place. A few reporters stiffened. Why is Gaza unlivable today? She asked, letting the silence stretch. Because Hamas, a terrorist group backed by Iran, launched a brutal attack on Israel. They slaughtered civilians, took hostages, and used Palestinians as human shields. Peter from CNN jumped in. But Karoline, are you saying Trump bears no responsibility for this crisis? Karoline let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. I'm saying Hamas started this war, she stated. But instead of demanding that Hamas surrender, the media is demanding Trump explain his response. She let that sink in. A young MSNBC reporter pushed forward. But Karoline, Palestinians say they don't want to leave Gaza. Is the U.S. prepared to force them out? Karoline met her gaze. No, she said firmly. The U.S. is not forcing anyone out. We are prepared to help rebuild, but we will not allow another Hamas-controlled war zone to emerge. James from the Washington Post pounced. The president said he's willing to use the military if necessary. Does that mean U.S. troops will be deployed? Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. The president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground, she clarified. But he's keeping all options open because when it comes to national security, he won't play political games. Some reporters looked dissatisfied. They wanted a reckless statement, she didn't give them one. She let a moment pass. The real question is, she said, scanning the room, why aren't you asking Hamas to surrender? Silence. A flicker of discomfort crossed James's face. Another journalist from NPR tried to redirect. But Karoline, there are concerns that Trump's stance on Gaza will escalate tensions with key allies. What is the administration doing to prevent further instability? Karoline exhaled slightly, as if she had been waiting for this question all along. The president has already spoken with Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, she revealed. We're coordinating with our allies to ensure that the region stabilizes. She folded her hands. But the media keeps pretending that Trump is making rash, unilateral decisions. A few reporters looked down at their notes. Others typed away, already spinning their stories. Karoline checked the time. Well, she said with a knowing smile. Next question. The media had failed to trap Karoline on Gaza, but they weren't done yet. If they couldn't win with facts, they'd try something else, misrepresentation. Peter from CNN adjusted his mic, ready to strike. Karoline, CNN is reporting that you suggested illegal immigrants aren't deserving of humane treatment. Do you stand by that? Karoline's brow lifted slightly. She knew where this was going. Peter, she said calmly, would you mind reading exactly what I said? Peter hesitated. He glanced at his notes, then back at her. Well, in context, no, Karoline cut him off smoothly. I asked for exactly what I said, not your interpretation. Silence. Peter cleared his throat. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, he admitted. Karoline smirked. Of course you don't. She tapped on her iPad, pulling up the transcript herself. Allow me to help, she said, turning the screen toward the cameras. She read aloud. I said, illegal immigration is a national security crisis, and the Biden administration's policies have made it worse. She looked up. Now, Peter, where exactly did I say anything about immigrants not deserving humane treatment? Peter's jaw tightened. Well, the implication was, Karoline held up a hand. No, Peter. CNN didn't report what I said. You twisted it. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press room. She wasn't done yet. This is exactly what the media does, she continued. You don't like what I actually said, so you invent a version that fits your narrative. James from the Washington Post tried to jump in. Karoline, even if the wording was misinterpreted, don't you think? Karoline cut him off, flipping the screen to a new tab. Let's talk about misinterpretation, James. She tapped on an article headline from MSNBC. It read, Karoline Leavitt refuses to deny Trump will use U.S. troops to remove Palestinians. Karoline looked around the room. Raise your hand if you were here when I answered that question. A few journalists hesitated before slowly raising their hands. Karoline leaned forward. Did I say that Trump would use the military to remove Palestinians? Silence. Anyone? She pressed. More silence. She tilted her head. Because what I actually said was, and I quote, the president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground but is keeping all options open to maintain stability. She let the words sink in. But MSNBC decided to rewrite reality, and now Twitter is filled with people believing a completely false headline. A young MSNBC reporter shifted in his seat. Karoline, that headline is just an interpretation of, Karoline laughed lightly, shaking her head. Interpretation? She repeated. No, that's called a lie. She scanned the room. This is how it works, she said. The media creates a false story, spreads it across every platform, and hopes people never fact-check it. She glanced at the cameras. And if you don't believe me, just wait until tonight's news coverage. A few journalists looked uncomfortable. Others were already rewriting their narratives. Karoline checked the time. Well, she said with a knowing smile. Next question. The press had been caught red-handed twisting Karoline's words, but they weren't giving up. When they couldn't trap her, they pivoted to Trump. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, his voice careful but pointed. Karoline, you've spent a lot of time criticizing the media's handling of rhetoric, he began. But let's talk about the president's own words. Karoline tilted her head slightly. Here it came. James continued, flipping through his notes. The president has a history of strong language, many would say inflammatory language. He's called political opponents enemies. He said we need to fight back hard. Given today's climate, don't you think his rhetoric contributes to division? Karoline let out a slow breath, then met his gaze. You mean the same way Ilhan Omar told her supporters to fight in the streets? James hesitated. Or the way Chuck Schumer threatened Supreme Court justices, saying they would pay the price. James opened his mouth, then closed it. Karoline folded her hands. This is what the press does, she said. When Democrats use aggressive rhetoric, you call it passionate advocacy. But when Trump says something strong, you call it incitement. Silence. Peter from CNN jumped in, trying to regain control. But Karoline, the difference is Trump is the former president and current leader of the GOP. His words carry weight. Don't you think he has a responsibility to be more careful? Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. Did you ask Joe Biden that? She challenged. Peter blinked. When Biden called Trump's supporters semi-fascists, where was your concern about division? When Hillary Clinton said Republicans were part of a basket of deplorables, did you ask if she was responsible for political violence? Peter stiffened, but Karoline wasn't done. Because when a far-left activist shot up a Republican baseball practice, nobody blamed Democratic rhetoric. When a man attacked Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's home, nobody asked if Chuck Schumer's words contributed to that. She let the words hang for a second. But when Trump says fight back, suddenly the media acts like he's calling for civil war. The press room fell silent. A younger journalist from MSNBC spoke up hesitantly. But Karoline, Trump has been accused of encouraging January 6th. Shouldn't he acknowledge the impact his words had? Karoline laughed lightly, shaking her head. Oh, I love this game, she said. Because when Trump told supporters to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard, you twisted it into a call for violence. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the reporters. But when Biden said in Philadelphia that Trump's supporters are a threat to democracy while standing in front of a blood-red backdrop, you didn't call it dangerous, you applauded it. A few journalists looked uncomfortable. Karoline scanned the room, eyes sharp. You don't actually care about rhetoric, she said. You care about who's saying it. Peter shifted in his seat. But Karoline, if Trump runs again, shouldn't he be more careful with his words? Karoline let out a slow exhale. The media has spent years demanding that Trump change his tone. She paused for emphasis. But has the media ever changed its tone about Trump? Silence. Did you ever stop calling him a threat to democracy? Did you stop comparing him to a dictator? Did you ever acknowledge that his supporters are millions of everyday Americans, not some extremist fringe? She scanned the room. Of course not. Because the media's job isn't to demand civility, it's to demand submission. No one spoke. Karoline checked the time, then looked back up. Well, she said with a knowing smirk. Next question. The press had tried everything, from twisting Karoline's words to blaming Trump for division, but nothing had worked. Now they had a new strategy. They weren't going to attack Karoline themselves. They were going to let Ilhan Omar do it for them. Midway through the briefing, a reporter in the back suddenly looked up from his phone, eyes wide. A few others whispered among themselves, glancing at their screens. Karoline noticed immediately. What is it? She asked, arms crossed. A journalist from MSNBC cleared his throat. Well, Karoline, he said carefully, Ilhan Omar is live on Morning Joe right now, and she's talking about you. A murmur spread through the room. Cameras zoomed in. Karoline smirked. Oh, she said, tapping her earpiece. Well, let's hear it then. A producer rushed forward, holding up an iPad with the live MSNBC broadcast on screen. Ilhan Omar sat across from Joe Scarborough, her expression tight with frustration. This administration is dangerous, Omar declared. Karoline Leavitt is spreading lies to cover up for Trump's failures. And let's be clear, she is deliberately putting people's lives at risk. Karoline raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Omar continued, her voice rising. The way she dismissed concerns over Trump's rhetoric, it's reckless. It's a direct threat to democracy. And let's not forget, she's using the same dog whistles that the far right has used for decades. The MSNBC host nodded in agreement, then added, Karoline even questioned your comments about fighting in the streets. Do you want to clarify what you meant? Omar didn't hesitate. Yes, she said firmly. I was speaking metaphorically. I was calling for people to stand up against this administration's attacks on our rights. But Karoline is twisting my words because she's desperate to distract from what's really happening. The clip ended. The press room sat in silence, waiting for Karoline's response. She took her time, letting the weight of it settle. Then finally, she said softly, shaking her head, "That's cute." Her voice was smooth, controlled. But here's the problem. She gestured toward the reporters. You all just heard what Ilhan Omar said on live TV, that she was speaking metaphorically, that she wasn't actually calling for violence. A pause. Now, let's rewind. She tapped her iPad, pulling up the exact quote from Omar's speech. She read it aloud. We might actually see somebody get killed. We have to fight this in the streets. She looked back at the room. Tell me, she said, her voice sharp. What part of that sounds metaphorical? Silence. She let the quiet stretch, then continued. This is what they do, she said. They say something extreme. Then when they get called out, they claim they were misinterpreted. She tapped her mic lightly, her voice dripping with amusement. So let's get this straight. When Ilhan Omar says fight in the streets, we're supposed to assume she means protest. She tilted her head slightly. But when Trump says fight like hell, we're supposed to assume he means a coup. A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances.